Madam President, I appreciate my friend and colleague, the senator from Alabama, for leading this discussion today. This is an important one to have, and I'm honored to be here to be part of it. You know, the situation at the border, across our southern border, is by any standard a humanitarian crisis, and nothing short of that. Vice President Kamala Harris, appointed by President Biden as his border czar, publicly declared that she would focus, as border czar, on addressing the root causes of immigration. However, now that Kamala Harris is the Democrats' nominee for the presidency, she and the legacy media want to pretend that was never the case. Axios even reported that Vice President Kamala Harris never actually had, it's a direct quote, never actually had the title of border czar. It's funny because that's a claim that contradicts the reporting that we've seen from Axios itself on this. In fact, we can see that right here in this chart. On April 14th, 2021, Axios reported that, quote, Harris, who had been appointed by President Biden as border czar, said she would be looking for the root causes that drive immigration. Moreover, a tweet from her official Twitter handle further emphasized her role. Quote, @POTUS asked me to lead our diplomatic work with Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. To address the situation at the southern border, we have to address the root causes of migration. It won't be easy work, but it's necessary. I agree, it's necessary. She took on this role, she acknowledged the role, and she failed. Since Biden and Harris's inauguration, a little more than 3.5 years ago, over 10 million undocumented immigrants have entered the United States. They've done so illegally. This figure exceeds the population of 36 states, meaning the overwhelming majority of our states, 36 out of 50, have populations smaller than the total number of persons entering the United States illegally on the watch of border czar Vice President Kamala Harris, thus creating a crisis that has been met with a troubling combination of silence and inaction from this administration, the executive branch of government responsible for enforcing our border laws and the border itself. Now, if the Biden-Harris administration were serious about addressing the crisis at the border and addressing the issue and ensuring in the process that real victims of government persecution in other countries would receive asylum here, then they would support reforming our broken asylum process. And sadly, they're not. We're still encountering over 100,000 illegal immigrants at our southern border each month. Now, since President Biden took office, there have been almost 10 million illegal immigrant encounters nationwide. Keep in mind, this doesn't reflect the sum total of those who have crossed into our country. These are just the documented immigrant encounters throughout the country. So there are more than that. That's a subset of the total flow of illegal immigration. Over 360 individuals on the terrorist watch list have been stopped while trying to cross the southern border. And shockingly, Madam President, 27,583 communist Chinese nationals have been encountered at the southwest border in the last year alone. That's a lot of people. And China is not close to the United States. By any metric, the Biden-Harris administration has shown no interest in securing our border. In fact, the data suggests this administration wants as many illegal immigrants to enter this country as possible. My Democrat colleagues want to pretend that Republicans are somehow responsible for this crisis. Why? Well, it's obvious why. They don't want to own it, given that their party owns the crisis, as their party is running the administration and is responsible for making decisions that has allowed this in. So what argument do they use in order to blame Republicans, who are not in control of the administration, do not occupy the White House or control the majority in this chamber. What's their argument as to why we as Republicans are to blame? Well, it's because we were unwilling to pass a bad immigration bill that would have normalized thousands of illegal entries across our southern border each month, and particularly in the hands of the Biden administration, could have and inevitably would have made the situation much worse. So today I'm offering a smaller bill, a narrower bill, a more focused bill that would help alleviate the crisis by closing loopholes in the law. These would be helpful. They are not necessarily things that represent a complete loophole, such that President Biden would be powerless to enforce the border without them. But they would make it harder for President Biden to justify the massive loopholes that he has manipulated. This isn't the entire answer. This bill wouldn't necessarily solve the whole problem. But if my Democratic colleagues can't agree that these common sense reforms need to be adopted, then how can we take their concern about the border crisis seriously? My bill, the Stopping Border Surges Act, would address loopholes in our immigration laws, which have helped create some of the perverse incentives for illegal immigration. It made it easier for the Biden administration to facilitate this flow of 10 million illegal immigrants into our country over the last 3.5 years. The bill would clarify that an adult cannot bring a child into this country expecting that child to be his or her ticket to avoid detention. This would help eliminate the disturbing practice of what's sometimes referred to by the Border Patrol as the practice of recycling children and babies by coyotes and cartels. People will bring in a child, and sometimes that same child will be brought in under similar circumstances over and over and over again as the ticket into the United States, the ticket thus making it less likely that they'll be detained and ultimately deported. It allows all unaccompanied children to be returned to their home countries, thus ending the incentive for the parents to send their young children here alone, leaving them vulnerable to abuse. Sadly, we see what's happening to those children under the supervision of the Biden-Harris administration and Secretary Mayorkas. They're trafficked either into child slavery, sex slavery, or as drug mules. My bill would require that the Department of Health and Human Services provide DHS with biographical information about the persons to whom children are being released, so that they know something about them, rather than just this is the person to whom you're going to release the child. It'd also require asylum seekers to apply for and be denied asylum in at least one safe country on their route from their country of origin to the United States. It would combat the Biden-Harris administration's obliteration of the credible fear standard by heightening the burden of proof. The correct application of this standard is pivotal to the operation of our asylum system and making sure that it's there for those who need it and not subject to rampant abuse by those not eligible for it. It's been corrupted over the years, but this administration has destroyed it entirely, manipulating it to the point where it's now beyond recognition. We must fix it. It's sad that we have to fix it, but we have to fix it in large part because it's been so distorted and abused by this administration, profiting international drug cartels to the tune of tens of billions of dollars a year, leaving a huge, huge wake of human suffering in its path. It would close loopholes and restrict asylum to aliens who present themselves at an official point of entry. We must eliminate these loopholes and not allow the Biden-Harris administration to make more of them. Congress needs to take back the authority to establish law. We can start today by passing the Stopping Border Surges Act. Ending the ambiguities in our current asylum law will help to mitigate the situation at the border and prevent unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats from acting with utter impunity to enforce their own policy preferences, culminating inevitably in open borders with more than 10 million people coming into this country in a space of only 3.5 years. And so I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. And to that end, Madam President, as if in legislative session, And notwithstanding Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent that the Judiciary Committee be discharged from further consideration of S-685 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there an objection?
Reserving the right to object.
Majority Whip.
Madam President, there's a pamphlet that's circulated to tourists and students alike entitled How Laws Are Made. And it tells the basic process under our federal Constitution for enacting legislation. It talks about committee hearings, it talks about votes in committee, votes on the floor, in the Senate, then in the House, conference committees, agreements, a lot of other votes. Finally, the measure is sent to the President, if it's successful, for his signature or his veto. That is the ordinary process. You will not see what's happening on this floor of the Senate in that pamphlet to describe how laws are made. It is such an unusual thing. Here we are in the Senate basically trying to say, I ask unanimous consent to ignore the Constitution as written and the laws as described and go ahead and pass this bill anyway. Well, you might say there's times when that's needed, and it is. But when it comes to the issue of immigration, there's a much broader consideration. The fact of the matter is, it's been almost 35 years since we've passed an immigration reform bill. 35 years. I don't know how many times a senator from Utah has voted for an immigration bill. Perhaps not. But the point is, we have tried and can't bring the measure to the floor. There is resistance and objection, primarily from the Republican side of the aisle, for any type of comprehensive reform. But there comes a time when there's a glimmer of hope. Once in a while, something happens around here and you think things are going to be different. And that happened not that long ago, a few months back. We had a conservative Republican senator from Oklahoma named James Lankford. James and I disagree on so many issues, but I respect him so very much when it comes to his legislative commitment. And he sat down with Chris Murphy, a Democratic senator from the state of Connecticut, and they said, can we, Republican and Democrat together, come up with a measure that won't solve every problem with immigration, but at least will move us forward. What are we going to include in that? Well, we're going to include provisions that dictate what happens when someone presents himself at the border, who would be considered in a fast fashion and who would not be. We're going to put more Border Patrol agents on the border. And they wrote a provision that the Border Patrol Agents Union, the thousands of men and women who risk their lives every day on the border, endorsed. Well, what are we going to do about fentanyl and narcotics that are coming into the United States as well? They added more provisions and more law enforcement to stop the flow of narcotics. There were provisions in that bill which I didn't like, but by and large I had to say that was a good bill. It really was a bipartisan effort to solve some of the major problems that we have. Some on the Republican side said, unless you pass this bipartisan bill, we're not going to allow other business to occur. It was a pretty serious showdown moment. So we were prepared to do it. A lot of us were prepared to vote for this measure. It was bipartisan, it made real progress, and it really addressed the flow of people coming across the border. What happened next is important. What happened next is one person stepped up and said, stop. That person was Donald Trump, former president of the United States. And he said, I don't want this bipartisan measure that Senator Lankford and Senator Murphy have crafted to pass in the Senate. Critics said, wait a minute, former president, if we don't do this, we won't do anything. We won't be able to address this measure significantly or constructively before the next election. And he said, so be it. Blame it on me, Donald Trump said. Kill this bill. And the word went out on the Republican side, stop where you are. No measure is to pass, not even this bipartisan measure. And when it turned out that only a handful of Republicans were willing to defy Donald Trump, the measure died. That was the end of it. And you have to ask yourself, did we miss an opportunity there? The answer is we certainly did. A bipartisan opportunity to do something constructive. And the decision was made by Donald Trump that he would rather have this issue going into the election in 2024 than to have any solution, bipartisan solution, which might inure to the credit of the Democrats as well as the Republicans. That was the end of the conversation. So we find ourselves on the floor today with measure that's being suggested on it by unanimous consent that, of course, did not go through committee, has not been reviewed, and it unfortunately has some serious flaws. Instead, this bill targets the most vulnerable people seeking safety and protection in the United States: children traveling without a parent or guardian, families with minor children, and asylum seekers fleeing persecution. The bill that's before us, the unanimous consent request, would strip away protections for unaccompanied children. It would deport many of them back into the hands of smugglers, keep others in detention for up to a month, and keep them separated from adults who could care for them. This bill would require families to be detained, a failed policy that has disastrous effects on children and doesn't make the border any safer. This bill would also create multiple new restrictions on asylum, undermining our longstanding commitment to refugees seeking safety, such as the people in Ukraine. Many of them were refugees to the United States once attacked by Vladimir Putin, and I believe that most Americans agree providing protection for them and their families is the right thing to do. The Biden administration is doing what it can under our outdated immigration laws to secure the border, and encounters between ports of entry have decreased by more than 50%. Yes, there were too many flowing over the borders at various times, but we have seen dramatic reductions in those who are going across the border now, and we could have seen more with this bipartisan bill, which Donald Trump and his loyalists ended up killing. The administration has dramatically increased deportations, made tough changes in our asylum system, and improved access to lawful pathways to citizenship. But ultimately, it is Congress' responsibility to reform our broken immigration system, which has not been updated, as I said earlier, in 35 years. To resolve our challenges at the border, we need immigration reform that will actually fix our broken immigration system and provide the necessary resources to DHS to secure the border. Rather than providing additional resources, improving infrastructure, or adding more lawful pathways, this bill would undermine fundamental American values and put families and children at risk. Recently, that bipartisan group of senators had a tough border deal put together. I want to commend Senator Lankford for his courage in stepping up, particularly when Donald Trump was opposed to him. I wish the majority of Republicans would have stood behind their senator from Oklahoma, but the senator from Utah and others decided they wouldn't. They would rather take these opportunities to come to the floor and try the unanimous consent route. Donald Trump was crystal clear. He said, blame it on me if the bill fails. The bill failed, and I'm blaming it on him just as he asked. He doesn't want a solution, he wants an issue in November. The time is long past due for my Senate Republican colleagues to stop partisan bickering, get behind James Lankford's effort, work on a bipartisan basis to pass the immigration legislation the American people deserve. I object.
Madam President.
Objection is heard.
Madam President.
Senator from Utah.
Madam President, I appreciate the thoughtful remarks of my friend and colleague, the distinguished senator from Illinois. He and I have worked together on many issues, and we don't agree on everything, but when we do agree, it's a lot of fun. We're able to do a lot of great things together. I appreciate his leadership on the Judiciary Committee and the fact that he's always been friendly toward me. I also appreciate his reference to our sort of the civics aspect of what we do. The notion of how a bill becomes a law is always instructive. It's always helpful to bring that up. You know, we've lost some of that in our system, and people get confused as to how laws are made. Of course, the very first operative provision of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 1, has only one clause, so it's Clause 1. The very first language after the preamble says that all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. Remember, legislative powers are lawmaking powers, meaning all power to make law, make federal law, are vested in this body. In this body and the body with which we share the legislative power just down the hall, the House of Representatives. Article 1, Section 7 elaborates on this function and makes clear yet again that you cannot make a federal law without following this formula. The formula prescribed by Article 1, Section 7 is bicameral passage followed by presentment to the President of the United States. You have to pass the same legislative text down the hall, also pass it here. Doesn't matter in what order unless it's a revenue bill, but that's not relevant here. but it does have to be the same text passed by both bodies. Then and only then can you present it to the President for signature, veto, or acquiescence. That's how you make a law. That's what the Constitution requires. Now, on top of that, we've got a number of other procedures that we've added by Senate rule, precedent, procedure, common practice. Those are not required by the Constitution, but those rules and practices are acknowledged as legitimate by the Constitution. And yes, most of the time we pass those, but it is ultimately up to us to decide when, whether, to what extent, and in what ways to follow all of our procedures. And I agree with the senator from Illinois. It does make sense whenever we can do it. We always should follow our own procedures. It generally works out best if we can move something through committee, if we can have a full committee hearing, and we can have what's called a markup, where we introduce and entertain amendments to proposed legislation, pass it out of committee, and then bring it to the floor ultimately. I think we generally have much better legislation when we do it that way. And I would love to follow that procedure with this particular bill. And if what the senator from Illinois and the chairman of the Judiciary Committee is offering is for us to have a full committee hearing and a markup on this bill, I would love that, and I would gladly entertain that. Tragically, in the Senate, we've seen a deviation from that same practice to which he attributes great significance, understandably, today. In fact, fully 94% of all legislative matters passed by this body are passed by this same procedure that I'm attempting to utilize here today, by unanimous consent. The way it works is essentially somebody makes a request and they ultimately come down to the floor, like I've done today, and say, let's call up and pass this bill. Why would we do that? Well, in many instances, committee chairmen have become somewhat stingy with what bills on which they're going to hold hearings and markups. We've been unable to get a hearing or a markup set on this bill. And so this bill, like so many others, in fact, like 94% of all legislation passed by this body, comes to the Senate floor today without the benefit of having had either a hearing or a markup. Well, that doesn't stop the 94% of the legislation from moving forward. In fact, in addition to those 94% of the legislative proposals that are passed by unanimous consent, an additional number of them, I'm not sure what the number is, it probably varies a little bit from year to year, an additional number of them are brought to the floor and passed not unanimously, but by roll call vote without having had the benefit of either a full committee hearing or a markup. This, too, is unfortunate. Sometimes it's necessary and unavoidable, other times it's not. The point is this: the Constitution, neither the Constitution nor the Senate rules prohibit passing legislation this way. Sometimes it becomes necessary where the other path has been made unavailable to us by the majority party and the committee chairman. In this circumstance, there's an additional reason why we need to bring this forward. We talked a minute ago about the legislative process required by the U.S. Constitution to pass a law, to make or change any statute that is federal in nature. You have to go through that Article 1, Section 7 formula. Bicameral passage in Congress, followed by presentment to the President for signature, veto, or acquiescence. What the Constitution does not countenance, certainly prohibits, is the making of new law or the modification of existing law by the executive branch of government or by anyone or anything outside the framework of Article 1, Section 7. That's what we've seen with our immigration laws, including and especially with this administration. With regard to laws that are relevant here, laws, for example, involving asylum standards. The asylum standards have morphed over the years, over many decades, and the practice of applying our asylum laws has become so different under this administration than what the law actually says. This is comparable in many respects to another great frustration of mine that is closely related to this, where we outsource de facto lawmaking authority to unelected, unaccountable bodies in the executive branch, allowing them to just make new law. We call them regulations to get around the obvious awkwardness that would otherwise be created by this thing called the Constitution, to which we've all sworn an oath. But we allow, in effect, the executive branch to make laws that way under the form of rules and regulations. Either way, whether it's by the stroke of the executive pen or whether it's through an administrative agency, we have seen laws being made and changed entirely outside the constitutionally authorized process recognized by Article 1, Sections 1 and 7. And so that's one of the reasons we're here today, because we've had the executive branch making and changing law, not authorized by the Constitution, and we've had a lack of access to committee hearings and committee markups. And so that's why we come here today and do this. And while it's not ideal, it is how 94% of the legislation passed by this body is, in fact, passed. So that kind of matters. That provides some helpful context. We've talked a little bit about asylum and about how the asylum laws have been abused and modified. You know, the idea behind asylum is that if you're subject to certain kinds of persecution in your home country, we want to provide people with a place to go. The problem we've had in this administration, the way it's supposed to work, is if you show up without documents at the U.S. border and you make the case that you're entitled to stay here as an asylee, well, you're supposed to be detained until such time as they can decide the issue. You don't have a statutory or a constitutional right to be granted asylum. It is a discretionary grant of authority given to the Secretary of Homeland Security. No one has a guaranteed right to it. And so you're supposed to be detained while they consider your application, whether or not they're going to grant it. But instead, what this administration has been doing is just saying, okay, come in, you claim asylum, and they let you go. And because there are so many people coming in, about 10 million of them, many of whom are claiming asylum, they decide that the best thing to do is not deport them because they can't handle all those asylum applications. They can't adjudicate them. They say, well, let's just let them go. Let them go and tell them that at some point you may hear about a hearing that will be scheduled before an immigration judge. We hope you'll come to your immigration hearing. Well, at the current rate, many of these people are being told that their immigration hearing may not happen until the mid-2030s. This doesn't make any sense. This amounts to a de facto change in law. Definitely amounts to a de facto change in law that we've got things like what's called immigration parole. Immigration parole is supposed to exist as a discretionary grant of authority allowing the United States government to let somebody come into the United States either for a specific humanitarian purpose or a public purpose. But it has to be individualized, not generalized by country, not broad categories, an individual person. The law specifies that. And an example of a humanitarian purpose is somebody is in a foreign country. They have, maybe their mother lives here. She's about to die. That person needs to come in and be there for the funeral with the understanding that he or she will promptly leave thereafter. The public use, the public benefit example would be someone who maybe speaks an obscure language. We don't have adequate interpretation services in that language here. We need somebody to come in and translate for that language. We allow them to come in, be a translator for that trial with the understanding that they'll leave. Well, this president has granted, contrary to what the law allows, he's effectively rewritten the law so as to just grant huge categorical blocks of immigration parole. According to country, like we're talking to the tune of hundreds of thousands of people who have been admitted in a single year on these things. That is lawless. That is outside what the law requires. So yeah, that is a change of law, and that's why we need to tighten this law here. Now, I do want to get to this point about the so-called border bill. The border bill that my friend and colleague from Illinois claims, mistakenly, but very wrongly, that was killed only by one man, Donald J. Trump. It's just not what happened. Not what happened at all. And I don't agree with his description of the bill either. The senator from Illinois and I share a common friendship with and great affection for the senior senator from Oklahoma. Senior senator from Oklahoma did a fantastic job. Has done a great job on so many things that he decided that he tried to negotiate this. And I think it was done at the request of the minority leader, the Republican leader in the Senate, to try to negotiate something. The Senate Republican Conference wanted legislation that would in one way or another, tie President Biden's hands so he couldn't continue to abuse and negotiate that system of laws. And so he went in there, he did his best to negotiate that. At the end, most of the members of our conference didn't feel comfortable with what he negotiated because it wouldn't adequately tie President Biden's hands. It's not his fault, and it's not Donald Trump's fault, but the fact is that most of the members of our conference didn't feel that it did enough to tie President Biden's hands. Perhaps under the jurisdiction of a different president, that legislation might have worked, but not with this president. It certainly didn't tie President Biden's hands. And so it wasn't Donald Trump that killed the bill, it was the fact that we didn't have the votes here. So look, this is a big deal, it matters. I reject fundamentally the premise that we can't reform any of our immigration laws without so-called comprehensive reform, which is usually code for something else, including allowing large numbers of persons entering illegally to be deemed legal. So let's make sure we have the facts right, both on the way laws are made and based on what happened with this legislation and why it's necessary to pass the Stopping Border Surges Act. Thank you, Madam President.